Let me start off by saying this is absolutely a personal decision for me. It was really difficult for me. I don't mean to project my own values and the limits of my own conscience on the entirety of the federal bureaucracy.
Right.
So let me first say that there are thousands and thousands of federal employees who did not make the same decision I did. And they are absolutely working to prevent this freight train from going off the rails and exploding. Okay, so respect for them. If you're a concerned American and you're hoping that some unelected official somewhere or a cabal of civil servants somewhere will resist this president and fight his policies from within the government, then you will be disappointed.
You never saw any resistance or deep state?
I certainly saw people's personal reservations.
I'm going to tell my story, and this is a story I've never practiced before, but I think it's time for Koreans to start telling their stories more. I'm going to tell my story in 3 parts. I think the first part starts in a land called Matinekok. Matinekok. Who here has been to a place called Matinekok? Raise your hand. It sounds familiar. Okay, we have 1 hand. So every single one of you should have raised your hands. Matinekok was the name of this place we're in right now. This land, this place was called Matinekok for centuries, for thousands of years before the first Europeans came here. The Lenape native peoples, the Pequot native peoples, they lived here. This is not a new world. This is not a new land. For thousands of years, literally, there were people who lived here. They built their families here. They prayed here. They buried their dead here. They built communities. They laughed. They loved, just like all of us do. They did that for thousands of years before any of us were here. Now, 400 years ago, Henry Hudson and the Dutch settlers came, and they started New Amsterdam. I think most of us know that. A few years after that, the British seized New Amsterdam. They renamed it New York, and they renamed this land Flushing. It was originally called the Dutch Vlissingen. They renamed it Flushing. In 1776, 243 years ago, New York and 12 colonies declared their independence from King George III. 150 years ago, Flushing, Bound House, was home to a stop on the Underground Railroad for runaway slaves looking for freedom in the North. And 34 years ago, and maybe this is where my story really begins, I was born just a few blocks away from here at Flushing Hospital. This is the second part of my story, and this is actually mostly about my parents. When my parents came to Queens, to New York in the early 1980s, there obviously were no more Lenape or Pequot. There were no Dutch. There were very few Brits around anymore. In fact, even by the early 1980s, in Flushing, Asians were the dominant ethnic group. We were the majority, ethnic Asians. My parents came, I'm sure this is true for many of the people in the crowd tonight. My parents came here to study. They wanted a better life, so they actually came separately. My mother, she came here to study. She was smart. She went to Yonsei University. She studied really hard, and she transferred to Hunter College to become a nurse. She wanted a professional job. She wanted, a good life. My dad, on the other hand, had no plan. He grew up in this coastal town called Samcheok. It's in Gangwon-do. He imagined America through these stories that he heard from Peace Corps volunteers who were in Korea. And these Peace Corps volunteers, they smoked pot, they sang rock and roll. And I think, when I talk to my dad, I still think he imagines America through Frank Sinatra songs. He still thinks America is my way. And he thought also that America was New York, New York. And so through a lot of, a different long story, my dad might be able to tell you, he got a tourist visa to come to New York, a temporary visa, and he never left. So they came here independently. My mom came to fill her head. My dad came mostly, I think, to fill his heart. And they met here, and somehow my dad convinced my mom to drop out of school, to marry him, who was, I think, 8 or 9 years older than her, and to quit everything and start peddling clothes on the sidewalks of Chinatown in Manhattan. And I've asked them a million. I don't know why my mom said yes. Like, who would ever? She was on this pathway for success, right? She was on this train. She had this plan, and she jumped off that train to go on this crazy adventure with my dad. And thanks to that decision, that I'd say maybe crazy, I don't want to say stupid decision, I exist today. Now, they quickly, after getting married, in the early 1980s, had 2 sons while they're still street peddlers. They saved enough money from peddling clothes in Chinatown. They made a lot of money, and they started a business in Jackson Heights, a coffee shop. And my mom was mopping the floors of that coffee shop when she went to labor with me. So I was born in 1985. So the reason I'm telling you all these stories, and so that's the end of the second part, is so much of my story begins before I existed, right? There's this whole collective story of this land, this place. There's a story of my parents. There's a story of Korean immigration that started long before I knew how to, before I was even an idea in my parents' heads. And this takes me to the third part, which is really about me. I was born in 1985, and I realize now that when I was born, I wasn't born a blank slate. I was born into communities. I was born into maybe tribes, into groups. My first community and my strongest community was my family. I obviously had my parents. I also had my harmony, my grandma. She cooked dinner for me every night. She'd walk me to school. I had 4 siblings, and we would spend holidays together. We'd celebrate birthdays, Thanksgiving, Christmas. We'd go on road trips together in our minivan. So that was my first community, my family. My second community that I was born into was maybe this Korean church community here in Flushing. So I went to church on Parsons Boulevard, this Catholic church, St. Paul's. And in that community, it was almost my gateway to my Korean identity. We went to mass, and then we'd eat Korean food in the basement. And then while the parents were all socializing and gossiping, I would go with my friends to Main Street. And we'd play video games, we'd eat namyeon, we'd do whatever. And we'd hang out there. So that was my gateway to Korean, or maybe even Korean American culture. And finally, my third community that I was born into, or that I grew up in, was my school community on Long Island. And this was actually very white, very kind of old European immigrant community. And that community was also invested in my success. I went to public schools there. My teachers cared about me. They put me in ESL classes for free. They corrected they put me in speech therapy. I used to have a lisp. They did that for free. I went to after school, swim team, math club, all this stuff. And what I realize now as an adult is all of those communities were really invested in my success. They wanted me to do well in different ways. What I also realized is that they were invested in a specific type of success. So after high school, I went to an Ivy League university. I graduated with honors. I started a job in Manhattan working for a consulting company. I did that for a few years. I made a good amount of money. And I accumulated all these material measures of success: a good income, a good education, a professional title, and I felt empty inside. And I felt empty inside because all those measures of success weren't things that I actually really believed that I wanted to do. And so while I was, I reflected on it, and I felt like I had been put on this train, and that all these members of my community were pushing me along these rails, keeping me going. They're using all their energy to keep me going faster and faster. And I never decided to get on that train, but I was on it, and they were pushing me really fast. And so while all of my colleagues at this consulting company and all my friends, they were looking at the next step, the next upgrade for their money, their income, the next upgrade for their credentials. Maybe they're going to go to law school, get an MBA, go to a hedge fund, start their own, startup, whatever. While all of them were doing that, I did something drastic, and this for the first time in my life, I did something really drastic. I jumped off the train. In 2010, after 3 years of consulting, I quit my job. I signed up for the U.S. Department of State, the Foreign Service Officer Program. I moved to D.C., I proposed to my wife, I got married, and then after less than a year, I was in a car on a road trip on the way to Mexico, to Ciudad Juarez. And that was the beginning of a whole new life for me. My first overseas posting was at the US consulate in Juarez, Mexico, interviewing visa applicants. I interviewed dozens, sometimes more than 100 visa applicants every single day. These were people who wanted to go to the United States temporarily, students, farm workers, business people, tourists. I also interviewed immigrants, a lot of people who wanted to immigrate to the United States. And in every single one of these immigrants, I saw that same spark, the same dream, the same hopes that I saw in my parents and my neighbors and all these communities that I grew up in. And you've probably, I don't know if you've been in a consulate, but it feels like a DMV. I was in this window, about 4 feet wide. There's this bulletproof glass. I have a computer. I have this facial recognition scanner, some fingerprint scanners. But otherwise, I'm just sitting in this window interviewing dozens and dozens and dozens of people a day. And it's easy to kind of get heartless and kind of, you stop seeing people after a while. You just start seeing like a number, like I got to do another interview, another next. And I remember when finally something snapped me out of that. And it was also the moment that I realized that the US immigration system really is broken. It's inhumane and it's cruel. And the moment I realized that was when I interviewed this kid. He stepped up to my window. So I'm sitting in my window, next, call a number. He comes up, he's 13 years old. And usually when I interview people in Mexico, they speak to me in Spanish. But he immediately came up and said, really shy, he said, "Hi, my name's Brian." Perfect English. This little teenage kid, he's got like a Hollister shirt on. He looked like someone, I would have gone to high school with, right? And I said, "Oh, hey, Brian, put your fingerprints there, let me verify your identity." Okay, Brian Rayo, what's up, how's it going? Who's sponsoring you today? Turns out Brian, 13-year-old Brian, had been living undocumented in California since he was 5. So it's 8 years. His parents had smuggled him in illegally. His parents had since passed away, and his grandfather was a US citizen and sponsored him to live in the United States, finally. And so his grandfather, sponsored him for a green card. And so finally, after 8 years growing up in the United States, studying, he was going to get his legal status from me, right? So he kind of explains to me this story. His grandfather had told him part of it. His parents, before they died, told him part of the story. And I'm really excited. So I'm like, this is a great story. This is one of these dreamers. He came in, no fault of his own. He was doing well. And here he was on his summer break, coming back to the country of his birth to finally get a legal status and then go back to his home, which was California. And I'm flipping through kind of the computer system. Okay, there's some mandatory stuff you have to check as you're going. I'm talking to him. And then I see a record based on his fingerprints that when he was 5 years old, when he first tried to enter, he had failed once before he got in. And the time he failed, a US border official took this 5-year-old's fingerprints and put in some notes about what happened. And apparently in San Isidro, in Tijuana, the smuggler that was with 5-year-old Brian gave 5-year-old Brian a fake US passport and said, "Here, go with this, go cross." And when the border official asked to show him this and keep going, and he was caught. And so the US border official took the fingerprints, wrote this whole story down about what happened. And at that moment, my heart broke because I had to tell Brian that his visa was refused. And not only was it refused, he could never return to the United States. There's a lifetime ban on ever traveling to the United States legally again. He could never get a visa legally again in his life. Even if you want to be a business person, he could not get a visa again. And for those of you who don't know, it turns out that under US immigration laws, to this day, if you falsely claim to be a US citizen for any purpose, it can be verbally, it can be on a form, you check US citizen, it can be presenting a passport, somebody else's passport, a fake passport, you are banned for life. There's no waiver, there's no pardon. You can never immigrate legally to the United States. And at the time I was interviewing Brian, that applied to minors too. So according to the rules that existed, I had to basically ruin the life of this 13-year-old who by no fault of his own had done this thing when he was 5 years old. And I basically banished him to a life in a country that he didn't know at all. And it broke my heart. I felt guilty, but I also felt powerless. I was like, what am I going to do? I could break the law, I could give him the visa and then lose my job. Am I going to do that? I felt guilty, and I feel guilty to say now and kind of ashamed that I just put my head down and I kept going. I refused his visa, and he wasn't the last one, the last dreamer I refused when I was in Ciudad Juarez. And for a long time, I just kind of buried it, and I just had this hope that this is so wrong that somebody will fix it. President Obama will fix it. Congress will fix it. Everybody knows this is wrong, right? And I just trusted that, and I buried that guilt, and I just kept going along in my career. I got on a different train. You know, I was on these different rails from before, but I was on this train. I worked in Lisbon at our embassy. I negotiated these research agreements between Portuguese scientists and American scientists. Then I moved to Canada. I was part of this this team that was kind of pushing U.S. trade policy, pushing U.S. exports to Canada. And things were going well. I was getting promoted again. I was getting awards for my work. I was getting ahead. I was on this train, moving fast again. And this time I had chosen to get on this train. And then in 2019, this past summer, I don't know if you remember this, but I saw a photo of this man with his daughter, and they drowned in the Rio Grande. And it's a terrible picture. He is laying face down in like a muddy bank, and he's got his daughter in his shirt, and she's like 2 years old. So I saw that picture, and immediately I had flashbacks of Brian and our immigration policy and how cruel and inhumane it was. And in their bodies, I saw my mom. You know, I saw myself. I saw my dad and his dreams, you know, his stupid plan to come here and sing Frank Sinatra. I saw all of the people in my community that I grew up with in those bodies. And I really thought, like, this could have been any single one of us. So this time I couldn't bury it. I realized that I was still working for a system, a government, an administration, a person who was pushing these cruel policies. And not only were they pushing these cruel immigration policies, they were trying to revise the story of America. They were trying to revise this collective story of immigration. Because our story is it's a story of immigration. It's a story of native peoples who were here for a very long time. And then a very short time ago, the Europeans came, and then the rest of us came too. So I was thinking about all this. I couldn't take it anymore, and for the second time in my life in the last 9 years, I jumped off the train. I quit. And then I quit. I wrote about why I quit in the Washington Post. The next day, I got invited to speak to Anderson Cooper. It all happened really quickly, and it's a whole other long story. It's a crazy experience to kind of go viral. And then I joined the Minkwon Center. The Minkwon Center, what I appreciate the most is there's this deep understanding. Even though their foundation is this Korean organization, a Korean-American organization, there's this understanding of a collective story. You can't tell my story, that third part, without understanding part 1 and 2. You can't tell the story of Flushing without telling the story of Matinecock and New Amsterdam. You can't tell the story of my parents' immigration without telling the story of Korean immigration and of the immigration of all the other peoples who are here in this country. And Minkwon and many other organizations recognize that these are collective stories. And so my one kind of call to action for people here tonight is this. 1, remember that these are our collective stories, and 2, this is a collective fight, you know? When we fight for the rights of immigrants and refugees, let's say, coming in our southern border, we are also fighting for our own rights. We're fighting for ourselves too. It's the same struggle. We're all on the bleeding edge of this history. It's a shared history. Thank you a lot. Thank you so much for having me. That's my story.